settle ourselves and thank you, Jesus, for this morning. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you. Come, Holy Spirit, and give us your wisdom for his glory. In Jesus' name, amen. So a lot of people ask me, why did I write this book? This is my 5th book, but it's my first parenting book, and I'm not a youth pastor, and I'm not a pastor, and so there's 2 instances in my life that were the impetus of this book. My first book was a coming-of-age novel called Hard Left. I have books over there. And this was a story of 3 teenagers. And my kids were teenagers at the time that I was writing it. So then I got this wild idea somewhere that I was going to write a curriculum for that book and try to sell the book and the curriculum to the California Department of Education. Oh, I went down in flames on that one. Very hard to do as a self-published author. But it at least gave me the feel of writing a curriculum for a book. And that book was mostly about coaching and mentoring and bullying, and that was the heart of that story. The second thing was I had a marketing department up in the Bay Area for over 20 years. And one of my longest running clients, although most were in high tech, was a Christian school. So my job as the marketing consultant was to fill up the enrollment in that Christian school. It went from preschool through 8th grade. So we would sit around the table as a staff and try to figure out why would parents, Christian and non-Christian, pay for Christian education when they could get a free public education at a good school right around the corner. So the director kept telling me, you should write that as a book. You should write that as a book. So it was kind of ingrained in my brain. You probably use that technique with your kids, right? You can do that. Yeah, you should go do that. You'd be good at doing that. So 3 of my books actually were born that way. 2 from instructions from actual human beings and 1 from God, who said in my Lumberjack Jesus book, you need to write that book. Don't write the one you're working on, write that book. One of the few times I've heard a real distinct call from God to write a book. So that's how it came up. That's how this book evolved. So we're going to do this as a workshop. It's not going to be a lecture or a seminar. We're going to do it as a workshop. So if you have questions, just ask them. If you have examples of what's worked in your family, of something that we cover, say, hey, I had something, hey, I did something. So I want you guys to participate. We're also going to be next week. I've got a few things planned next week, but we can also open it up. I'll give you a little homework, not much. We can open it up to next week to a lot more questions. So the emphasis of this book is the subtitle. So I want you to read that subtitle. That actually was the working title of the book for about 3 years. But my editor said, that's an awful long title for a book, right? So then we got kind of fancy and put Gen Z and teen and that and all that. Amazon search words and things like that. But the guts of this book is 33 strategies to teach teenagers self-reliance, confidence, and responsibility. Now, this book is predominantly based on Proverbs. You'll see the Proverbs listed in the back that I used for this book. The first time that I read through Proverbs was probably as a young Christian 30 or 35 years ago when I found Christ. And, you know, I could read 5 or 6 verses of Proverbs and I go, oh, that's interesting, good, nice capsulation. But then, before this book, I read Proverbs through a couple times, all the way through. And I began to see these patterns, these repeating patterns within Proverbs. And that became this book, or at least the foundation of the book. People said, is this just for teenagers? No, it's not. There's some very specific strategies within here that are for teens, but all of these strategies are for kids of almost any age. As soon as they hit 5 or 6, you can began working with, and you probably already have been working with these particular strategies. The research I did for this book was a lot of Christian parenting writers, a lot, all the way back into the 1990s. Sounds like a long time ago. Like 30 years ago. It's like, how did that happen? I even went back to a Wayne Dyer book in the 80s that I used when we were raising our kids, and Dobson and a few others. But I also reached into some of my background in business, some of my background in coaching, sports. I also did some leadership training. Some of that is in this book. And I worked for about 10 years with a career counselor in my 30s and 40s, and you'll see her books in here too as a reference. So I've got some of her exercises that I've incorporated in for kids too. And then a lot of people said, is this just for Gen Z? And I would say yes and no. So yes, I think that it is for Gen Z, because I think we need to instill self-reliance, confidence, and responsibility in today's kids. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But it's also for kids of any age and any generation. It's just not for Gen Z. So let's take a second to define what Generation Z is. So if you're looking for this book and you want a real deep dive into what Gen Z is, it's not in here, okay? It's a foundational Christian parenting book, but it's just not for Christians either. Okay, all the books that I write are sort of a mission field for me. So this one definitely has strategies about praying and listening to God. It's got scripture verses, it's got a prayer in each chapter. But you could give this to one of your friends that maybe doesn't know Christ and maybe is asking questions. And they would look at this book and look at the table of contents and say, oh, that'd be good for my kids. I could learn a lot. They also might learn a little bit about God in there too. So it's written for a Christian audience, but it's also written for a broad audience. So Gen Z, here's a couple things that I found out when I was doing the research about Generation Z. So they typically define Gen Z as being born in the late 1990s into the late 2010s, right? So kids being born right now probably won't be in Gen Z, although they can stretch, social scientists can stretch those definitions out quite a bit. Like boomers, it seemed like, I'm a boomer, it seems like boomers are like 4 generations or whatever, from 45 to whatever. So here's a couple things about Gen Z. They could be the most diverse group of kids ever in America. Racially, ethnically diverse. They're digital natives, right? They live on digital. They could be the best educated generation ever in America. But there's some conflicting information about that now. American education is, according to some people, kind of hit a peak and it's coming down a little bit. So here's some interesting ones, which make you think, well, okay, I can buy those first two. This one, they could be the most financially pragmatic generation. And the thinking there is their parents went through the Great Recession of 27 and 2008, and right, so parents lost jobs, kids saw that. It could be, I don't, that could be a stretch. It might be okay. Here's the one that struck me. One author called them mentally stressed. Like their mental health. Caleb's laughing back there. Are you nodding or are you?
Yeah, it's just because I'm in college though, like don't worry about me.
Yeah. So here was the thinking. What has this generation experienced? Gun violence in schools? Oh, right, horrible. Police brutality, and climate change. Now I grew up in a generation where I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania. They had an air raid siren, and people were building concrete bunkers underneath their homes because of the threat of nuclear war. Right? Missiles in Cuba, 90 miles away, destroy the whole United States. Scary time. But we didn't hear it 24/7. Right? We listened to Walter Cronkite or somebody on the news at night, and then you went on with life. This generation hears it 24/7, right? Mentally stressed. Okay, so 3 little favors that I'd like you to do for me as we go through this morning and the next couple weeks. One, I'd like to add you to my email list. Okay, I send out emails about 3 times a year, so you won't get bombarded, but I actually take some of my writings and share it with some of my audience before it actually comes in a book form. So if you wouldn't mind doing that for me. The second one was I'd love for, once you finish the book or get through it or understand what it's about, to write me a review. That's how self-published authors like myself actually sell books online. People go and they read the reviews on Amazon. That'd be the best place to do it. Even if you didn't buy the book on Amazon, sometimes they let you write a review. The other one would be Goodreads. So if you just make a note of that, I put note cards in your book, so if you could write a review, I would appreciate it. And then God has convinced me on this book to give it away. I traded the cover artwork with another lady. I did some work for her. I got the interior formatted for not much price, so I'm willing to give this book away. So if you have other groups that I could speak to, that I could give this book away and do a similar type of talk or any type of talk, like your life group would be a great place to do that in, if you're in a life group but have other parents in there. Moms groups, if you're in a book club, I do a lot of book club signings and discussions and things like that. So if you find another place where I could do a similar type of talk, I'd love to keep that in the back of your mind and let me know. Okay, so let's turn to page 35. We're going to talk about 2 or 3 strategies this morning. And I picked out strategies I wanted to talk to today that maybe were new to you or maybe a little controversial to you. I didn't pick out, let's teach our kids to pray or let's teach our kids to listen to God. That's in there, certainly. I didn't mean to say that those aren't important, but I just wanted to pick out a few that may be a little bit different for you this morning. So, 35. So, Aaron, could you read out loud that scripture from James?
Sure.
Please.
Make this your common practice. Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you can live together whole and healed. The prayer of a person living right with God is something powerful to be reckoned with. James 5:16.
So, I started writing this book about 5 years ago, and I was a member of a writing group in Santa Barbara. This is when writers get together, usually 15 or 20, meet a couple times a month, and they read new material to other writers and get feedback. So, as far as I know, I'd been in this group about a year by the time I read this chapter about teach your teens to apologize. And so I knew that there were no Christians in the audience. Right now, I'm reading a Christian parenting book, so mostly writers that are writing romance novels and science fiction, or, cops and robbers type stuff. So I read this chapter, and there was a young woman across the table, and she raised her hand and she went, wow, this is all new information to me, because my parents taught me never to apologize. It's a sign of weakness. And I'm sure my mouth dropped open, and I wanted to say, how does that work in your family? How's that working for your parents? How's that working for you and your parents? How's that work within siblings? Because I think as Christians, You know, that's a foundational part of our belief in God, right? That we come and confess and he forgives us, right? There's so much grace and mercy in there, but if only the latest statistics are 20 to 25% of Americans even attend church now. So your kids are going to grow up in a society that doesn't have that foundational need to express an apology and ask for forgiveness and be forgiven. There's a second chapter after this, number 6, about accepting an apology. So when we talk about kids and teaching them to apologize, I remember when my son was, 3 or 4, and he is a very high-spirited, independent, ultra-competitive young man now, and always was. And if we would ask him to apologize for something small, like taking something from his little sister or, saying something, he would get this look on his face, and his lower lip would start to quiver. He'd go, sorry. You could tell there wasn't an ounce of sorry in him, right? But that's at least where we start. Mm-hmm. So there's another theme that runs through the book in almost every chapter, that parents have to set the example. You have to be the role model, right? So my first question on this chapter is, as parents, what could you apologize to your kids for to show them how that works? Can you think of something that you would have to apologize to your children for?
Oh, I have an example. Are we giving examples?
Sure.
Yeah.
Or are we just like thinking this to ourselves?
No, let's say them out loud.
Okay, so Jesse's really forgetful. And I got him his first cell phone, and I said, you have to make sure you keep track of this. And so we were out one day, and I said, where's your phone? He says, I don't know, and I lost it. Well, we get home, and it turns out that it was with my stuff. I had put it somewhere.
Busted.
So I had to apologize to him for that, and tell him, that was my fault. I really am sorry. He said, that's okay. So, yeah. That was something that I had done.
Yeah.
And
Got it. Anybody else can think of an example of when you need to apologize to your kids for something?
Being late.
Being late?
Yeah, he has to be. If I'm going to pick him up somewhere, he needs to be on time. But it's not always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do kids, you said, Mary, he accepted your apology, right?
well, it's interesting too, because I was the one that was forgetful, not him.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
There's another line in the book that says,
I mean,
nobody is perfect, right? There are no perfect parents. Okay, I want you everybody to say that out loud. There are no perfect parents. Okay. Right? You're going to make mistakes. I remember, like I said about my son, he was ultra competitive. He played 3 sports in high school. He actually won a scholarship to play Division I football. He was so competitive. But he was so competitive growing up that, he couldn't control his emotions. We'd always work on, okay, you got to control your emotions. You can't let your emotions go crazy on a playing field. And there was one time, I think he was a junior in high school, playing basketball against one of Amador, against one of the big rivals in their district. And his man scored the winning bucket at the buzzer to win the game. And Connor, when he came out after, I waited for him after the game, it was like half an hour after he come out of the locker room, he's crying. He's 17 years old. I mean, he's beside himself, right? He's so distraught. And stupid me I said, hey, we've been working on this, you gotta control that. And he F-bombed me and pushed me away. And, you know, the next day I went to the coach, I said, you gotta discipline that boy, he's out of control. And the coach kind of, good for him, he kind of went, well, yeah, I'll think about that. He knew it was just between me and my son, right? And then when I realized that I was in the wrong, right? I should have waited a day or something to talk to him about that. It was an emotional time. So I had to go apologize to him, right? I was wrong, but my fault, my bad. Yeah, okay. You know, and then there's a couple of suggestions, actually, in the book. In every chapter, you'll see a lot of suggestions about how to introduce this into your family, for parents apologizing to each other in front of your children. Very powerful stuff, right? You don't have to go to the big apology, right? The one you need to do in private, just the two of you. You know, yeah, everybody's going, yeah, I remember those. I had one of those for Nancy, my wife, and, you know, I had to apologize, and it was literally, it was a marriage-saving, I think, apology. I did something really stupid. Not that stupid what you're thinking, but pretty stupid, right? And I had to apologize more than once. She accepted it, and then it was like, I could tell she didn't quite. So those type of things you don't have to do in front of your kids, but there's lots of examples in the book about building this in. And the more that I've worked on this book and seen the power of apology or lack of one, like in my family, there's a little division in our family because somebody wouldn't accept an apology, right? And you probably have that in your family, someplace, where there's just a little bit of break in the family or in the relationship because somebody either didn't apologize or didn't accept it. So I think this is fundamental to your kids, that they grow up happy and healthy, that you teach them to apologize. Any questions about apologies?
I've got a comment.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, on the flip side of that, we apologize for showing them that, hey, it's okay, but it also is teaching them about forgiveness. Like,
Absolutely.
that it's really, it gives them an opportunity for that.
So turn to page 43. So the next chapter is teach your teens to accept apologies and forgive. So I thought it was such a dynamic topic in the book that I gave it 2 chapters. Right? So I agree, Barry. That forgiveness part and accepting forgiveness. And it's an interesting, I worked with a guy that he said you can't go back more than about 2 weeks on apologies. You know, if it happened 3 months ago and you're looking for an apology, man, that's a long time to go back, right, into history. Oh yes, I did something like a year and a half ago that I got to get it out quick. You got to do it quick and get it out there. And then especially with your kids, if I know you'll find that they need to apologize for something, and if they do, no holding it over the head. Once they apologize and you forgive, no coming back to that and saying, hey, you remember that time 3 years ago? And no, don't go back there. Teach them, like you said, to accept that forgiveness and move on. Right? Okay, let's move to the next one, which is strategy number 10. I want you to turn to page 73. So, Brian, would you read the Proverbs there on 73?
The plans of the diligent lead to profit. Surely as haste leads to poverty.
So this strategy is encourage teens to have a job early in life. This is one of those controversial ones. So what do you think about that? Let's have a little discussion. Should they or shouldn't they? Aaron, you were...
Yes, they should.
Oh, Jeff, you're a yes, they should guy? Okay, good. Aaron, how about you?
I love the idea of it. I think I would say yes. I think it helped me. But it's also, I think, as your kids get older and they have heavy, like, loads, it's a little bit hard in practicality to figure out what that looks like, but
Yeah.
I believe in it.
Good. Anybody else?
When I was in high school, my parents wouldn't let us have a job because they said school and your sports, that is your job right now and you need to do really well in school. But we were allowed to have like babysitting jobs on the weekend. We just couldn't have anything during the week that, you know, with school you have to come home and study and do your homework but
How about the summers?
during the summertime, yeah, we were lifeguards and we could do
Okay.
things like that, but it was really, they really prioritized school is your job, do it well, you know? So they didn't just breeze over it, like, you don't have to work, but it was like, no, this is your work.
Right.
And I appreciated that.
I think jobs aren't for all kids, right? All teens. My son never had a job until he got out of college. His job was earning his scholarship. So he worked all summer long, took classes, so his football season was less classes, and he trained all the summer, so he could really never have a job. My daughter was begging us to let her go to work at 16. She worked every summer. She worked Christmas vacation, some spring breaks. My wife had a friend that had a small business and needed some help. It's still who you know, it's not what you know, especially at that age, right? And they got together and Kelly worked for her, I think even into college during the summer, she worked for this lady. She never not worked. My daughter is a bulldog that way, right? But it's not for all kids. I started working at 14 in summers. My dad, his father had a Buick dealership in the little town that I grew up in. My dad must have had an argument, something, never heard the story. Left that business, bought 20 used cars and set up a little used car lot. He had 2 employees during the summer, his salesman and me. So the salesman would pick me up. I didn't live with my dad. My parents were divorced when I was a young boy. Salesman would pick me up at 7:45, Monday through Friday, every week in that summer, and I would wash those cars every single day, 5 days a week. He had the spiffiest cars in town, right? I would come to him on a Friday, I can still remember, and said, Dad, walk into his office, it's Dad, wash those cars 4 days this week. They're really not dirty. And he would go, Sherman? He called me Sherman. It's a long story. Long story. My middle name was Herman. So he'd say, Sherman, there's 2 of us in the office. Which one's the boss? And I go, this is not a trick question. I'd say you. He'd go, you're right. And the boss wants you to wash those cars this morning. And I go, shaking it here, boss. I'm about to wash the car. There's so much to learn. I mean, I was lucky. I worked for my dad all the way through college, right? He paid me above a minimum wage of some of the other guys working in the garage, just so that I could put it away in my college fund, I was very lucky that way. And a lot of teens don't have parents that have jobs or companies that you can work in. But I think it was a great learning experience for me. If I look back at me and my kids, they learned a lot in college, and college was important to my children. There's lots of things you learn about in college, but you learn so many different and valuable things as you work for somebody. And I got a whole lot of lists in there, in that chapter and the following chapter about good work ethic and how to find a job, because it's really tough for kids to find jobs these days. The statistics say that let's see, what year? In the 1990s, 35% of teenagers worked. In 2015, which was the last year I could find, you want to guess what that percentage is now?
10%.
A little higher,
15.
18. So it's really gone down in half,
Mm.
right? It's fallen because there's a lot of people at the lower levels of jobs that kind of sink into those typical teen jobs, like service and restaurants and all those that. Now adults are working those jobs. Plus, it's harder. When I was a kid, and all my friends, when they went to get a job, they would go in person and fill out an application, right?
Yeah.
They'd fill it out, and the guy could see who you were, and if you were, stuck out your hand, gripped it hard, and looked him in the eye, and all those typical things that your parents tell to do when you meet a stranger, then they get a good feel. But now a lot of that is online, right? You're just another online person, so it's harder for kids to get jobs. Okay, so for those last two topics that we covered, teaching kids to apologize and encouraging working, what was new for you in those two topics, or what was something you already knew but was validated? So either new or validated for you in those two topics. Anything come up?
Our son's been working since 14.
14.
Yeah, of his own volition. And just last week, my dad was saying he needs to just work on school. He's, my dad didn't let me have a job, kind of thing. That my job was school, and so it's helpful to hear that validation that he's not working on weeknights anymore, but that working is good for him. And yeah, so a lot of voices.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, he loves it.
Yeah,
He'd
sometimes
work
he
7 days a week if we let him.
That's amazing.
Well, he works at a bike shop and he likes bikes and they're nice and
He spends all his money at a bike shop too.
yeah.
It's like a paid hobby then, right?
It is.
That's
Pretty
really
much.
amazing.
It's awesome.
So
Some kids love to work. They're just
Yeah.
geared for it, right?
Yeah.
Other kids, they're not. They got more maturing to do or more growing up to do or whatever you call it. So, yeah. Okay, let's jump to strategy 13. That's on page 93. As you can see, I'm jumping around a lot, so I picked out ones that I thought might be interesting. Who wants to read that passage in Romans? Justin, go for it, buddy.
Okay. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Romans 12:3.
So this strategy is teach your teens to give credit to others for their successes. Interesting. Huh? Or maybe another way to say that is share their successes with others. In a lot of my research, if you Google self-esteem in parenting, or books about self-esteem in parenting or whatever, you'll see a big influx of books that probably started in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, that were all about kids need to have their self-esteem boosted. The whole book was just about boosting their self-esteem. That was the number one thing and the biggest thing that kids needed.
Mm-hmm.
Because parenting philosophies kind of go like this, right? And that was the era of we need to boost our kids' self-esteem. And I say self-esteem is great. Yes, I would never say don't boost your kids' self-esteem, but you also have to balance it, right? Can't just be, there's a person in my family who, I don't know if I want to say this on video. What if they see it?
We can edit it later.
Okay, phew. Maybe you know people
Have a friend.
that you say, you wonder if their parents, not that they didn't correct them and not that they weren't good parents, but that they boosted their self-esteem so much that people can't take a little criticism. They can't take a little feedback. They can't take a little, you know, maybe it doesn't work that way. What do you mean? My parents said I do everything perfectly, right? My research says that, especially that Simon Sinek, you know, that he's written a couple of books, he's got some TED Talks. He does this great one when this generation of kids get into the work environment, a lot of them can't take criticism from the boss, right? It's like they've never been criticized in their life. They've always been boosted in self-esteem. It's like, wow. So there's a lot in that chapter about when to boost self-esteem and when to back off a little bit. Like my daughter started first grade when she was 5. And if you run into teachers who say, oh, girls are mature earlier, we'll start them, and boys you hold back later. Right? My son didn't start first grade until he was almost 7. Right? So he was a good year or more older than my daughter. And my daughter, those first 4 or 5 years, she was always the youngest in the class, a little immature within her grade, and she always needed a lot of self-esteem boost. You can do this. Stick with it. You'll be fine. You know, she would cry over homework that she couldn't get done. You can do this. Just stick with it. You'll get it. You'll figure it out. Where my son was like, he didn't need that as much at that age. He did at other ages, and it kind of fluctuates with the age and circumstance of your kids. I want to give you a little research on a book that I did, that I read last month. It's a really interesting book called The Upswing. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's hard to recommend because it reads like a college textbook in economics and political science. I mean, it's a slog fest to get through that. But what was interesting is he laid out a whole book that compared the 1890s, you know what that generation or that era was called? It's the Gilded Age, right? And it became very much an I culture. Everything was about the individual. Government, they never talked to, one side never talked to the other. Income inequality, huge. All the robber barons run the railroads and all that, made all the money. Public education was way down. Civil rights, people didn't have civil rights, women couldn't vote, all that kind of thing, right? And then he charged this upswing about to the 1960s, where America came together. The government actually passed laws for the good of all people. Imagine that. It can actually happen. Not like today, right? Civic groups were formed, like Kiwanis and Rotary and all those type of things. Public education became free. Taxes actually helped the poor people more than just the rich people. So he said there was this whole upswing in culture to a we community in the 60s, and then you could probably predict what happens, right? Now we're back down here again. So I think your generation and your kids' generation are going to be the generation that send us up to the next upswing. And I think part of that is giving credit away, building a teamwork with people. They're going to need to give some of this credit away, or at least share it, right? In jobs, in relationships. It's not all about me, me, me. It's about we, right? So it's a great thing to instill in your kids. And I give a lot of examples in that particular chapter of how they can share their sports success. You know, my dad's great in math, right? My dad was great in math. I didn't get that gene. I don't know what happened, right? Or sharing their academic success or their sports success or their, I think what you'll find is teachers will like those kids a lot more, right? It's not all about me. It's fine. We were teamwork. We got together as a group. We had a study group. We got it done. She's good. He's good. It's all fine. I think that's a key to building up this generation that is going to help America rebound from where we are now. Maybe you like where we are now. I don't think it's such a great hot place. So, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to skip that last one and I'm going to open it up to a couple things. One, any questions you have, and two, what you might want to talk about next week, because we're going to meet here again next weekend at 8:30. If you want to bring somebody or send the other better half of you, great. If you want to invite some people, I got lots of books I'm willing to give away. I'm going to cover, I'll do one more story before we open it up to give you a little hint about what I want to cover next week for maybe half of the time, and then we can open it up for the rest of it. I think I mentioned that my parents were divorced when I was 2 years old, early in my life. But my dad, so I was raised mostly by my mom, but my dad lived in town about 5 blocks away, actually. I could walk to my dad's house, right, which I often did for math help. Because when they started putting letters in math, wait a minute, I thought English was letters, math was numbers. What are you combining these two for? It doesn't make any sense to me. But I was also very blessed that both sets of grandparents lived in town, right? Love my grandparents. They actually lived side by side. They lived next door to each other. So, and they shared a driveway. So if you went up the driveway and went straight ahead, you hit the Kirkpatrick garage, which Grandmother Kirkpatrick often did in those days. Because, you know, 50s and 60s, big cars, tiny to garages, right? And if you went the other way, you went to the Arthur residence. So my brother and I, just two of us, Mom would drop us off, and we'd often spend a weekend over there at both houses going back and forth. And I'm sure that my grandmother Arthur believed that the happiness and success of my life was determined on how well I knew my manners. She emphasized that a lot to us. Manners, manners, manners. I'm sure if you ask my kids, they would probably say, oh yeah, my parents were tough on manners, right? But I believe that the happiness and success of your children can hugely depend on how well they can understand and utilize their God-given gifts and talents. God-given gifts and talents. Like I said earlier, I spent about 10 years of my life in my 30s and 40s working with a career counselor that helped me narrow that down and narrow that down. I used to do a lot of public speaking at the junior high and mostly junior highs in Santa Barbara on career days. So I'd volunteer and they'd bring you in and you talk about your career, bring a little thumb drive in, they'd plug it in the computer, you talk about your career to the kids. And I was sitting in the waiting room before we were sent out to our classrooms talking to this fellow that was beside me. And he said, what you talking on today? And I would say, well, I'm talking about, you know, how I started here in life and I went this way, and I finally found the career that was best for me. I kind of, he's going, I think that's the worst advice you could give to those kids. I said, oh, are you an engineer? He goes, I am. I think you ought to find one thing and stick to it and work hard and just go straight for it all your life. And I went, okay, that's a different philosophy. It didn't work for me that way, right? So I'd like to spend some time next week talking about how you can help your kids to discover and utilize their God-given gifts and talents. But I also want to know, and I'll write it down and do more research if I have to between now and then, what you want to talk about next week. I'm going to give you a little bit of homework about read through the table of contents. There's 33 different strategies there. Right? We can talk about mobile phone use if you want to. We can talk about other kids if you want to. But there's something that's really boy, if I only knew something more about this, that it would help me as a parent.
I think what we're all gonna, well, for our age kids, what we're coming up against is like the whole identity thing and the shift to they, them, and just handling, talking about who you are and knowing who you are, and it's a whole world I am so not familiar with, and it's coming fast, you know?
Yep.
Our kids are already, every kid in this room is for sure already dealing with it, maybe not the littles, but it's a big thing, big thing.
Okay, good. We can talk about that. And invite more people. The more people we have, I think John Ireland says it best, we learn in community, right? You don't learn just studying the book and trying to put all those things together. We learn by, how do you handle that? What's your son do? How does your boy work with that? What's your daughter, you know? Good. What else? John?
I do think technology is just such a big. I'm looking at this graph, and we're just so into technology in 2020, and it's like our kids' generation is the first generation that's grown up with a computer in their hands,
Yes.
walking around. And how is that gonna? How do we help guide that and not just totally reject it, but use it for good somehow?
Yep.
It does feel so isolating and disconnecting.
There's a reference list in the back of the book. There's a couple great books that I found. One is 52 Ways to Connect with Your Smartphone Obsessed Kid, which is written by a young man with a lot of interesting information. And the other one was the one on page 232, the first one at the top, Seduce, The Grooming of America's Teenagers by Opal Singleton. Powerful book.
Hmm.
She says, you know, if you're giving your kids a cell phone at a certain age, you're putting the world in their hands. Everything in the world is within a few touches for them. Are you really sure you want to do that? She's got some tough examples to share in that book. So there's a whole reading list back there too. What else? Caleb, what was the toughest thing growing up for you to handle?
I think one of the harder things growing up for me was like living in a society that tells you that if you're not doing, like if every second of your day isn't filled with extracurriculars, then like you're not going anywhere, you're not getting a scholarship, you're not, like you're gonna end up just staying in your hometown, which totally isn't true. But that was one of the, well, what I perceived as truth growing up. So, looking back, I wish that I would have had like more downtime, more encouragement to go spend like a Friday or Saturday night, just like throw your kid a 20, say go bowling, go do something fun. Like even if you have like maybe you have trust issues with your like kids because of some things that they've done that you're like, hey, that's kind of sketchy. Like I know like there were times for me and my sister where we were not up to the best behavior. My parents had to do that for us, but like still going out and like just not taking yourself too seriously was those were the times that I look back on now. I'm like, wow, like those were really like great and formative for me. I definitely don't look back on the nights where I was doing calculus till 12:30 because like I had so many other things going on and like, wow, those were really good times. You know,
Yep. It's changed a lot in the last couple of generations that way, hasn't it? You know, my parents used to let me go,
Totally.
right? There was a playground down at the end of the block, and my mom said, I got a whistle. She had one of those army whistles.
Oh
my gosh.
Yeah, and she said, when I blow that whistle, you got 5 minutes to get home for dinner.
Love that.
So I knew that I could be with, I could figure out, how far I could be, that I could still hear that whistle. Donna, here we
Well, I
go.
was gonna say along those lines, teaching our kids how to rest, how to Sabbath,
Yeah,
how to have a rhythm of work and rest. Because I think the healthiest people I know in the world are people that have that rhythm. And if we model working 7 days a week, and if we encourage our kids to just be grinding it all the time, I think we're gonna miss out. There is something to just Sabbath that is so crucial to our lives, and I think Caleb's touching on that a little bit too. It's hard to teach our kids that because there's just always more to do. And I find when my kids want to rest, they just want to go like play video games, or that's not really rest though. That's just like
Well,
filler. That's
yeah.
just
It is to them.
But I would hope that we can create spaces of rest without screens and
Yeah.
technology. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I appreciated that one of these, some point in here said to teach your kids to communicate without digital technology. Because, yeah, to pick up a phone, or I have a kid who got in trouble for passing notes in class, and it's like,
Oh, I love that.
because I told her, and not in class actually, but I had told her, it's a girl, but that to actually handwrite something and deliver that to a person is different, and to not lose that. I really hope that we would have some kids who don't lose that. I was like, but not in class, like after class. But, yeah, to create spaces that are not digital.
Or just allowing them to be bored too.
Say again?
Allowing them to be bored.
Yeah.
So if they're not doing something, it's like within 30 seconds, I'm bored. And it's like, well, you gotta figure out how to fill that boredom, because without just going to a screen, because that automatically fills your head with information. And
Yep.
it's like, no, you need to not have your head filled with information. You need to think about it and figure out what to do with it. So, but it's hard because it